Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Republican strategist and former chair of the Montana Republican Party, Erik Iverson. Erik, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, I am really excited to dive into the presidential race. As we sit here right now at the end of 2023, obviously we are on the precipice of a presidential race in 2024. So let's kind of talk about where the candidates are right now at the end of the year. So recent polling obviously shows that Trump is far and away the front runner. And then depending on the poll you look at, Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis is at a distant second place. So as of right now, what do you make of the polling?
Look, I think the one thing that's been consistent about the polling has been President Trump's lead throughout this race. I mean, sometimes he's above 50, sometimes he's below 50, but the margins have always been 30, 35 points, and the race up until now, and perhaps into the foreseeable future, is still about second place, and that's kind of where we are. It's been like that really since this summer. When DeSantis finally got into the race, you did see, Trump still in the 40s, and DeSantis was, remember, he was at 29, 28, 30% when he first got in. He's half of that now. And, President Trump seems to have gotten, ticked up 3, 4, 5, 6 points even from this summer. So the only thing that's been consistent is President Trump's lead right now over whomever happens to be in second place.
Let's talk about that fight for second place. As of right now, it's former Ambassador Nikki Haley and Governor Ron DeSantis really neck and neck. Former Governor Chris Christie and Vivek Ramaswamy are still in the race as well. So when you look at these people, the fight for second place, who is in the best position as we sit just a few weeks out from Iowa?
Look, I think that anybody is kidding themselves if they don't think that Nikki Haley has strengthened her position over the last couple of months, really since the first debate, which was kind of late August time frame. So I think that what you've seen is she's come on stronger in Iowa, particularly since Tim Scott got out. I think she picked up his level of support. So she's basically tied with DeSantis in Iowa. And if you look at the polls that have come out in the last few days in New Hampshire, looks to me like she's in a pretty clear second place in New Hampshire. So really, I think, for DeSantis and also for Nikki Haley, Iowa could be a major decision point in what this race looks like heading into New Hampshire and beyond.
I do want to talk about polling both in Iowa and New Hampshire. We'll talk about New Hampshire in just a little bit. But what we're seeing in Iowa pretty much reflects what we're seeing in national polls with Trump with that far and away lead, Governor DeSantis as well as Nikki Haley neck and neck, and then Vivek Ramaswamy and Chris Christie lower down the poll there. So when you're looking at Iowa, what's the most important thing you're looking for?
Well, first of all, you're looking at that overall number, and like you said, Trump has a healthy lead. You look at evangelicals. Where is that all-important evangelical? You got about half the electorate in Iowa that describes himself as born again or evangelical. Well, President Trump also leads with this important voting bloc. So then you look at who's in second place. Right now, it looks to be a margin of error race, meaning statistically tied between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. So, I think with where we're seeing Haley, and we'll talk about New Hampshire in a minute, but where we're seeing Nikki Haley kind of surging into second place in New Hampshire, it really becomes critical, I think, for Governor DeSantis to finish in a strong second place in Iowa. If he somehow ends up in third place in Iowa, Haley in second place in Iowa, even if it's just by a hair, I don't see how DeSantis can continue on. Now, flip that. I think if DeSantis comes in a strong second place showing, say he's 10 points ahead of Nikki Haley, then you move into New Hampshire and DeSantis has a rationale. Well, look, I was a strong second in Iowa. Presumably Haley ends up a strong second in New Hampshire. Then I think all three, obviously Trump, Haley, and DeSantis, could move into South Carolina. But if Nikki Haley comes in second place in Iowa, I don't see much of a rationale for DeSantis soldiering on after that. Right now it looks like he's in fourth place in New Hampshire in a lot of respects. So I think really Iowa is critical. And then, the big question there is when someone drops out, be it Haley or DeSantis, where do their votes go? It looks like right now if Nikki Haley were to drop out, about half of her votes would go to Ron DeSantis, but about 30% is going to go to President Trump. So I think there's this myth out there in the media that, well, geez, if Haley drops out or if DeSantis drops out, 100% of their voters are going to go to the other, and their vote total is going to double. Well, that's not the case. Consistently, President Trump is still getting not quite a third, but 28 to 30% of the vote of either Haley or DeSantis if they drop out. So the math is very, very difficult right now, even for whoever comes out in second place in Iowa or New Hampshire.
So are you saying that DeSantis has the most to lose in Iowa?
100%. Yeah, no question about it. He has to come in second place, and not like second place by a percentage point or 2 percentage points. He needs, he needs to come in a strong showing in second place. If Trump's going to be in the mid 40s, DeSantis needs to at least be in the mid to upper 20s, and hope to heck that Haley is somewhere in the mid to upper teens so he can have a good 10-point victory. If she's nipping at his heels in Iowa, where he has literally, Governor DeSantis, I think, and smartly, has gone all in. He's done the full Grassley. He's done all 99 counties in Iowa. He's moved most of his senior leadership team to Iowa. He sort of, pushed all of his chips and went all in on Iowa. And if that doesn't work, kind of hard to go back to your donors and back to your supporters and say, hey, listen, we gave it everything we had in Iowa and we finished in third place, but you should trust us in New Hampshire and you should trust us on to South Carolina. I don't think that works. So I think DeSantis absolutely has the most to lose. If Nikki Haley comes in third place, she can always say, hey, look, DeSantis put everything he had in there, and I'm in a strong second place in New Hampshire, and then after New Hampshire it goes to my home state. So I think for sure DeSantis has the most to lose in Iowa.
I think these numbers right now beg the question of, why does second place even matter? I mean, Trump is so far ahead. And if 2016 taught us anything, it's really, polls aren't concrete. But why does second matter so much when he is beating them in the polls by 30 points, 40 points, in one poll, 50 points?
Yeah, I think it matters only from the standpoint really of momentum, right? I mean, we talked a little bit a few minutes ago, about the math. Let's just say, for example, Trump's at 45 in New Hampshire and Nikki Haley's at 30, which is what some of the polling showed. DeSantis is at like 8 or 10. If he drops out, you're still only, even if all of his votes went to Nikki Haley, it's still not enough to catch Trump. However, if she can clean up enough of that to make New Hampshire a tight race, now all of a sudden, say the field kind of clears and she can come within 4 or 5 or 6 points of Trump. Now she's got some momentum. She says, hey, now we're heading into my home state, and that's going to be my firewall. So I think that momentum and appearance of momentum for Haley is really, really important. It's still a stretch. I mean, even with all of those scenarios happening, Trump's really strong in South Carolina, too. So, it's not like everybody's been making these assumptions all along about, well, if this person gets out, this is what's going to happen to Trump and this and that. The one thing that has remained constant is Donald Trump's standing in this primary. And it is consistently, 40s would be low, but it's consistently mid to upper 40s, sometimes into the 50s. And it hasn't really mattered what's gone on in the news cycle. Hasn't mattered who's gotten into the race, who's gotten out of the race, who got important endorsements like Governor Reynolds or Bob Vanderplaats in Iowa that DeSantis got. None of that has affected Trump. It's moved around the margins of who's in second or third or fourth. It's kind of rearranged some of the deck chairs on the Titanic, if you will. Hasn't impacted Trump, and that's the challenge. And I think Nikki Haley, with at least having her home state coming up after New Hampshire, would have a rationale to soldier on after New Hampshire if she can have a strong showing there. But for the others, I think it's pretty hard to make the case if you can't get into second place, why you keep going on.
Yeah, based on these numbers, one thing for certain is he has, and by he, I mean Donald Trump, really has this unshakable support. But New Hampshire is where it gets interesting. According to a St. Anselm poll, Trump is at 44%, Nikki Haley is at 30%, Christie is at 12%, DeSantis a distant 6%, and Ramaswamy at 5%. So if your name is not Donald Trump, what are you doing in New Hampshire? What does this mean for you?
Yeah, the bump that Nikki Haley appears to have gotten from the endorsement of the New Hampshire governor seems to be a lot more impactful than the endorsement of the Iowa governor for Ron DeSantis. So with Haley now all of a sudden in a firm sort of second place in New Hampshire, then you can start to look at, okay, if Chris Christie were to get out, where do his votes go? Well, the data shows that majority, almost 2/3 of Christie votes at least, are going to go to Nikki Haley. DeSantis, she'll probably get about half of them. Ramaswamy's votes would go to Trump, although I don't see him really getting out. I don't think that seems to be his mindset at this point. So I think, really, that's why I say DeSantis has so much to lose in Iowa. If Nikki Haley were to come into second place in Iowa, there would be tremendous pressure for the rest of the field to just get the heck out of New Hampshire, and that being Christie and DeSantis and Ramaswamy, to just pack it all in. Because if she's in a strong second place already in New Hampshire, if she were to come in second place in Iowa, I think this ends up a two-person race. Probably by the time folks in New Hampshire pull the lever and vote, certainly by the time we get to South Carolina.
Is it too early to even say this is a three-person race between Trump at the top and then DeSantis and Haley behind? Should Chris Christie and Vivek Ramaswamy pack it in, or wait till Iowa at this point?
In my view, there's no question it's a three-person race. And I don't think any serious person could argue otherwise at this point. Look, Governor Christie's a great guy. He's always had a good message. He resonates well in New Hampshire. But if we're looking at that poll that you just talked about being anywhere close to accurate, with Haley at 30 and Chris Christie at 12, it's like, come on, man. Like, if it hasn't happened yet, when's it going to happen? Because you're not going to gain momentum coming out of Iowa. So what's going to spark your momentum? I don't see any sort of intervening event where somebody says all of a sudden, wow, I'm moving off of Nikki Haley and I'm going to Chris Christie. Even if Nikki Haley comes in third in Iowa, that doesn't really help Christie because he's not even going to be on the radar there. So, in my view, it's a three-person race right now. The others, I think, are just sort of going through the motions at this point and don't really have a realistic shot of making this a competitive two-person race.
Let's pivot a little bit and talk about voters' second choice. A recent Harvard Caps Harris poll found that there's, quote, at least some chance 63% of Trump primary voters would support another candidate. So once again, if your name is not Donald Trump, what does this mean for you and what should you be doing?
The electorate, the Republican primary electorate in general, particularly in these early states, meaning Iowa and New Hampshire, the first two states, somewhat nationally, but really in these first two states, the primary electorate breaks down into sort of three categories. You've got roughly 20 to 22 to 25% who are never Trumpers. They're not going to vote for him under any circumstance. You've got about 25% that are always Trumpers. Doesn't matter what he does, they are going to vote for him. And then you've got about 50% in the middle who are willing to take a peek at somebody other than Donald Trump. But if they don't like what they see, they have no problem voting for Donald Trump. And it's that 50% that none of the other candidates have been able to appeal to yet. They're willing to stick their head up and look around and say, I would consider an alternative if a better one percolates up. Nothing has come along yet. No candidate's come along to really scratch that itch. So, I think you can look at these 63% numbers, but really nobody has made the compelling case to pull them away yet. You could argue that Nikki Haley is in position to maybe begin to have that conversation with them, but that's a far cry different from actually converting them into votes.
What would scratch that itch for the 50% there? Would it be someone who is Trump without the baggage per se? Because when you talk about that, or when we talked about that maybe at the midterms last year, that was Ron DeSantis. Would it be a never Trumper like Chris Christie? Obviously not, because they're not supporting Chris Christie. So what type of Republican would that be?
It needs to be somebody it's closer to the Trump without the baggage, because it needs to be somebody who is willing to take on the big fights. I mean, right now, there's a lot of reasons why Republican primary voters like Donald Trump, but one of the main reasons is it's that old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Republican primary voters tend to see Donald Trump as the guy who's willing to wage the big fights against their enemies, be they Joe Biden or liberals like the Squad or the news media, the United Nations, all of these, these boogeymen, these groups that Republican primary voters don't like. They look at Donald Trump and they say, that guy is willing to take on the people I don't like in the biggest and the boldest way. And so, someone's going to have to make Republican primary voters feel very comfortable that they're going to continue to take on the big fights that Donald Trump is continuing to wage against some of those entities and folks that Republican primary voters don't care for. And so you've got to be able to pass that threshold. Once you can pass that threshold, then you need to turn to an electability argument. Look, if you're Nikki Haley, you want to be able to say, listen, there's really no scenario where Joe Biden can beat me. There are a few maybe where Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump. I'm going to take on the big fights. I'm going to fight the people that you don't like. And oh, by the way, I got a better chance of winning the general. The problem with that is at least recent polls have showed President Trump doing pretty good against Joe Biden right now. Now, a lot of things can happen. There are a lot of smart people that thought 2022 was going to be a landslide for Republicans. It wasn't. So look, candidates still matter. Turnout operations still matter. But I think, initially to even get to that stage where that 50%, of primary voters who would consider somebody other than Trump, you've got to make sure they understand that, you're going to take on the big fights against the people they don't like. And Trump does that on a daily basis. And that's one of the reasons he's had staying power.
A recent News Nation poll offered some insight into voter second choices. DeSantis leads the pack at 36% of GOP voter second choice. Ramaswamy had 15%, and Nikki Haley has 14%. So can you read the tea leaves here? What does DeSantis need to do? Because he has the more of the second choice to tap into that Trump base between now and Iowa especially.
Yeah, I mean, and you're exactly right. Right now, DeSantis tends to lead that second choice because he is looked at of the remaining candidates as the one who most closely, like I said a minute ago, is taking on the big fights. I mean, he's sort of he's taken on the woke cancel culture in Florida. He stood up to Fauci. I mean, he was one of the first governors kind of open things back up and bring some COVID sanity to governing. Whether what you think about the fight against Disney or not, that resonated with some Republican primary voters. So that's why DeSantis is getting that second choice right now. But the problem for him is it's where he's out on the ballot. And if he can't convert some of that, peel some of that Trump support off, and or scoop up some of the never Trump vote that's going to Haley and Christie right now, he's in a tough spot. He's got to finish in a strong second place in Iowa, or I don't see any viable path for him after that.
Erik, before I let you go, I want you to let us know, what are you specifically looking out for between now and January 15th, the Iowa caucuses?
Yeah, a couple of things. Can DeSantis and this ground operation that they've been touting, is it real? Are they actually getting people to commit and getting them to stay committed? Can they find a way to gather in some of that never Trump vote that Nikki Haley's getting right now in Iowa? Those are the big things. I mean, DeSantis really, he spent the time there. You're right, he's got a strong second choice position there. But it's his ground game that that he has sort of always been relying on and pointing toward. And that has to bear fruit for him. Otherwise, it's going to be a long caucus night for the DeSantis team.
Erik Iverson, thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for your insights, and I hope you come back on as Iowa comes closer.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.